Hey guys, welcome to our live stream conversation with Dr. Bruce Blair, co-founder of Global Zero, who was also a former nuclear launch officer. We are here in Washington, D.C. for our 2016 Action Lab, where we brought together 50 of Global Zero's top activists and volunteers from across the United States for 4 days of skills training and panelists. So welcome. We are about to start in just a couple minutes. And also, if you have any questions, definitely tweet them at Global Zero and use the hashtag #EliminateNukes, or you can tweet them in the chat box right on the side of the video here. So we'll get started in just a minute or two. Is it on?
Okay, everyone. Hi, everyone. We're ready to get started here. I'd like to welcome you all to tonight's conversation with Global Zero co-founder Dr. Bruce Blair. I also want to thank those of you who are joining us online and remind you to tweet us your questions at Global Zero using hashtag #EliminateNukes, or you can chat them to us on YouTube. My name is Jessica. I am the Research and Policy Associate at Global Zero, and I've had the pleasure of working to support Bruce's work for a few years now. We asked Bruce to join us for this conversation because as Global Zero staff, every once in a while we get a chance to sit down with Bruce, and he regales us with his stories and experiences in the field of nuclear weapons and arms control. And they are just so interesting and frankly frightening a lot of times that we invited him to share them with all of you. So we hope that they will give you a sense of why this work is so important and can motivate you as they motivate us to continue our work to eliminate nuclear weapons. Just to get some background on Bruce, in addition to co-founding Global Zero and serving as the principal author of our policy reports, Bruce is a research scholar at the Program on Science and Global Security at Princeton University. His principal research interests are in technical and policy steps on the path toward the verifiable elimination of nuclear weapons, with a focus on deep bilateral nuclear arms reduction, multilateral arms reduction, and the alerting of nuclear arsenals. Bruce served as a U.S. Air Force Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missile launch control officer from 1972 to 1974. He has also served as a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Studies program at Brookings Institution and was awarded a MacArthur Fellowship Prize for his work on nuclear arms control in 1999. He's the founding board chairman of the Center on Global Interest, a nonprofit organization focusing on U.S.-Russian relations, and he currently serves as a member of the U.S. Secretary of State's International Security Advisory Board. Bruce, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us.
My great pleasure to have this conversation. Let me just say, first of all, since you mentioned my appointment to the Secretary of State's Advisory Board, that I'm speaking entirely on my own personal capacity, I don't represent the views of the State Department of the U.S. government. I have to say that. Thanks.
Thank you. So I'd actually just like to start off kind of from the beginning with what led to your interest in nuclear weapons, basically. Was it you being a missile launch control officer, or was it before? Were you interested in nuclear weapons? Where did it start?
That's easy. I was being drafted into the Army, and I decided that I preferred being an officer in the Air Force, so I signed up to become a 90-day wonder, which means that you spend 90 days learning how to walk and salute at the same time. And it took me 91 days to do that. And when I graduated as a second lieutenant, I was sent to Omaha, Nebraska, which is the headquarters of the Strategic Air Command. And just randomly, I was assigned to the unit that was responsible for maintaining a airborne command post aloft 24/7, manned by a battle staff headed by a general officer all the time, whose responsibility essentially was to manage a nuclear war after the United States had been struck by a massive Soviet attack. So I got really involved in the command and control side of the issues of nuclear weapons very early on. And the more I dug into that, the more worried I became. But we'll get to that eventually, I guess.
Yeah, so kind of getting into your time as a missile launch control officer, you actually served during the Cold War, when we had a lot more nuclear weapons than we do now, which is crazy to me because 7,000 that we have now is way more than we need. But can you actually take us through what a typical day was like when you were on duty as a launch control officer?
Sure. First of all, it didn't feel like the Cold War. In the early 1970s, this was a period of détente between the United States and the Soviet Union, a period of fairly cooperative relations. It was not really the worst moment in the Cold War by any means. So there was a general sense that we were not going to get into a nuclear war. So most of us went out on our alerts, which we did about 5 or 6 times a month, riding a car, a truck, several of us, sometimes 3.5 hours to get to underground launch control center. This was in Montana. Drive from the main base out to this underground center and would relieve the previous crew and assume responsibility for receiving and implementing any orders that might be sent from higher authority calling for the launch of my missiles, our missiles. And I and one other young person, also in his early 20s, had the ability and responsibility to fire up to 50 missiles in our squadron. We were connected by underground cable from our underground center to missile silos that had Minuteman missiles in them. And they were unmanned, and the two of us could fire under various circumstances up to 50 of these missiles. They were aimed, they each carried a huge megaton warhead, gigantic thing. And they were aimed at mostly military targets in the Soviet Union and China, as well as a great many major cities like Moscow and Beijing. So basically our job was to sit there and monitor our missiles and wait for someone to press the big button in the sky, send a launch order, which we would then carry out very quickly. And I'll just tell you the procedure because I practiced it hundreds of times fighting a nuclear war. Mostly in a simulator, a mock, it's like a mock simulator that you train pilots in, well, you also train missile launch officers in it. And so I actually became very much like Pavlov's dog in the execution of orders in the simulator. You would get messages that would gradually escalate to an initial launch with few weapons, usually a lot of weapons. But invariably, these exercises and training would culminate in an all-out nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union, or in some scenarios, China. The Soviet Union was the main adversary. So we would go out and sit there waiting for this order that might come at any moment. The closest I ever came to that sensation that I experienced in the simulator of escalating up the ladder to nuclear war was in 1973 during the Yom Kippur War, the Arab-Israeli War, when I was in one of these underground launch centers, when we received an order that came from higher authority, came from the Pentagon actually, with the permission with seatbelts to brace for possible nuclear war and incoming nuclear explosions that would rock and roll our capsule. So that was probably the most sobering and serious thing that happened to me as a launch control officer.
So what goes through your mind when that happens? Like you said, you had a ingrained response. Basically, are you emotionally like afterwards? Are you like that was?
Oh man, it is a rush of adrenaline like you wouldn't believe, and it's enough to sort of knock you out of your chair. But with you've done this 100 times in the simulator, and you train for it. You find yourself in this ladder of expectation. You've been conditioned in all of your training to expect to go to the next level of alert and culminating in an all-out nuclear exchange. So your heart's beating very rapidly when you receive an order like that, and I have to say, it was extremely exciting. What tempers the emotion, not only at my level, but at the level of the entire nuclear chain of command, up and down, all the way to the president, back down, is that everyone immediately goes to checklists. There are big books of checklists at every level of the chain of command, including the presidential level. And so the process can be extremely rote. I began to understand that the scenario for the launch of nuclear weapons is sort of the enactment of a prepared script, particularly in the event that we have detected an apparent attack against the United States. Because then that sets off a chain of events that is extremely intense and has very, very tight deadlines. Because a missile flying all the way across the planet, say from Siberia, Soviet Siberia to Montana, and my launch center is a 30-minute flight. And so what happens, and this has been alluded to by other guests here at this event, is that you have out in Colorado a team of officers whose job is to assess whether we're under attack based on sensor information fed to them from satellites and ground radar. And how long do you think that they're allowed before they have to make a preliminary assessment as to whether we're under attack or not? And remember, these missiles take 30 minutes across the planet, but from submarines, it's half that time. It's more like 15 minutes. This crew has 3 minutes to decide whether we're under attack or not. If they believe we might be, then the president is notified, and his top nuclear advisors are notified, and then he is briefed, or she in the future, on his or her nuclear response options and their consequences. And the person who would give that briefing is like either the commander of strategic forces out in Omaha, who I used to work for, or someone out at that base. His job is to brief the president. And how long do you think, under these tight timelines, this person has to brief the president on his response options and their consequences? As little as 30 seconds. Then the president has to absorb this information, consult with his advisors, and make a decision on whether to retaliate and how to retaliate. And if he wants to retaliate before the command system collapses, including Washington, including a decapitation of the president and probably most or all of his successors, or before the other nuclear forces of the United States are struck, if he wants to make a decision before that catastrophe, he's given how much time? I think Bill Perry mentions today here at our meeting is 6 or 7 minutes. It could be less. It could be a few seconds. It could be as much as 12 minutes. But clearly, it's not a lot of time for rational, deliberate thought about the role of nuclear weapons in our security. The president decides to order the launch, then the codes are sent down the chain of command to youngsters like me sitting in the underground silos, or bomber pilots, or submarine crews at sea. We receive the message, and as I said before, we quickly decode it, and then we carry it out. And I was a Minuteman launch control officer, and I could carry out a launch in 1 minute. And so those are the timelines. That's a sort of a posture of quick launch on warning, with forces and command systems on hair trigger alert. And that was the world that I was living in. It's one of the disturbing things I discovered in the course of my experience in the Air Force, that we really didn't have a policy of writing out an attack and for the sake of deterring the other side with a second strike. We had really a policy of either launching first or launching on warning, a very quick second launch. We had almost all of our weapons were aimed at military targets, although we had hundreds of nuclear weapons aimed at places like Moscow and Beijing. We still have today over 100 weapons aimed at Moscow. Not much has changed. We still have basically a war-fighting nuclear doctrine with the early use of nuclear weapons that's part of that. And we have a very creaky command and control system that could readily collapse under attack. And for all of these reasons, throughout the Cold War, we worried so much about the vulnerability of our nuclear command and control system that every president of the United States, from President Eisenhower in the 1950s through the end of the Cold War, pre-delegated his nuclear authority to generals in the field. 12 generals in the field. I worked for one of them in Omaha at Strategic Air Command in the 1970s. This is a very long-winded way to get to the point that I came to believe fairly early on, and I was reinforced in this belief by my work after the Air Force, doing highly classified research for the U.S. Congress and then even for the Pentagon, that we were in a very unstable and dangerous state of affairs in our nuclear relationship with the Soviet Union, and that it was all too easy for the balloon to go up, all too easy that through false alarms, inadvertence, unauthorized actions, or other causes that we could find ourselves easily in an all-out nuclear war that was never really intended. This was reinforced also by my discovery when I was a launch officer that I and one other young person at the time could launch all of our 50 missiles without anyone giving us the authorization to do that. So safeguards were also creaky at the time. They've since improved. And I went on in my career for another 20 years to think that the highest priority of the U.S. government, especially in nuclear policy, was to fix all of these command and control problems, to ensure that we could never go to war inadvertently or without authority or by the hand of some general, etc. So I played with that for 2 decades before I came to the conclusion that this system was not fixable. I'll pause there for a second so I can catch my breath. But I also learned the same problems applied in spades on the Soviet side as I got to work on the Soviet side. I was not yet to this to the point where I felt that I would advocate the complete elimination of all nuclear weapons. I was in fix-it mode for a long, long time.
So, a little bit of levity, maybe, going back. I kind of did a survey of Global Zero staff, and one of our favorite stories is of you in the hammock, being sleep deprived.
Okay, well, these are organizations. They're human organizations, and all human organizations cut corners. And so we had our procedures and our checklists and our nuclear weapon safety rules and all the rest. But we conducted what we called field procedures, which is what really happens out in the field, particularly after you and one other person close an 8-ton blast door behind you, and you know that no one can tell you what to do except for the president. And then you start to sort of, do what you think makes sense, common sense, not what's in the manuals and the checklists. And so every single day, every single crew in the U.S. nuclear force, Minuteman force, deliberately violated nuclear weapons safety rules. And they did so, for example, by sleeping on the job. As I said, we did not have technical safeguards on our missiles at that time. They could have been fired without anyone giving the authority. And so there was a standing rule, still in place today pretty much. It's called a two-man rule, that everyone who's around nuclear weapons or their control systems had to be with another person who understood the system and could monitor any mistakes made by the other party or some unauthorized action. Two people had to stay awake all the time. That was the gold standard nuclear weapon safety rule in place. But you get tired out there. You're on alert for 36 hours, and you maybe haven't slept for 36 hours. You're starting to hallucinate at some point. Yeah, if we went to nuclear war with the Soviet Union at a certain bad time, in the alert cycle, you would have hundreds of quasi-hallucinating launch officers responsible for prosecuting this war. So we slept. Some people slept. They found a way to make a bed, and among the many options was to strap up a hammock and hang it from the rack of equipment in the underground launch control center. And so that's what many of us often did. We would pile into the hammock, and it would sort of rock and roll. And sometimes you would wake up because you had a test that you needed to run on the missiles, and you'd sort of push off the equipment and swing over and press another button and swing back. Basically, yeah, we would do that sort of thing. Another example is, there was a lot of black humor and levity and pranks that we played. I remember once during turnover, you check to make sure that the launch codes, these are supposedly presidential launch codes, are in good shape, they haven't been tampered with, and you accept them then from the previous crew, and then you put them in your safe and lock them up with your padlock, and the other crew disappears, and then you're responsible. We sat down for dinner a couple of hours after this turnover, and we get dinner from topside, from a cook who sends it down to you, and we lift the hot plate tray lid off the top, and look down, and to our dismay and amazement, we see our launch code sitting on the plate that has just been delivered from topside. Somehow, the previous crew managed to after we inspected the codes and thought we had put them in our safe, the other crew had managed to rip them off and take them topside and send them back down. There are a lot of snafus happened. There was a launch order that was sent out by mistake once. I wasn't on alert, but it was briefed the next day. It was a practice launch order, and you get those all the time, and you go to the checklist, and you go through the business of pretending to go through the launch sequence. But after you get the initial message, you get retransmissions, because higher authority knows that a lot of us are not really alert. when the first message comes down, and so we oftentimes have to copy the retransmission that comes down. Well, the retransmission, instead of sending the flag word at the front of the message for an exercise launch, they accidentally attached the flag word for an actual launch. And so when the crews decoded the retransmission, they decoded the flag word that was secret then and still is, that we had been sort of trained to recognize as the first thing that we would see if we ever got a launch order. And that was also an adrenaline rush for a lot of the crews until they discovered the message did not validate.
We haven't heard that one, and that's another one that's super interesting. So we're going to actually move forward a little bit and to eventually co-founding with Matt Brown Global Zero. And I was kind of wondering what you saw as lacking in the nuclear arms control and non-proliferation field that you thought Global Zero could fill the hole.
Right. So I came to the view that that we were not making fast enough progress, and with the Russians in particular, in standing down the nuclear arsenals of our two sides, and that we were in this dangerous posture, and that something could happen, and inevitably something would happen, if we didn't act with greater conviction and haste, really speed, to eliminate nuclear weapons, or reduce them, I should say. I also, during this period, particularly during the late 80s, early 90s, got to understand a lot about the Russian perspective. I spent, I went to Russia so many times, and I got to meet and make close friendships with my counterparts, including some of them who had their missiles aimed at my missiles and me in Montana during the time that I was there. And I got to understand what was going on their side, and to understand that in human terms, and to understand that we had a lot in common. And no one wanted a nuclear war, least of all people who managed the weapons, we thought. And we became friends, and we realized we could work together and ought to be working together to accelerate this process. And so that gave me a renewed kind of faith that we could move faster in the direction of reductions. I still was not at a point of believing that we could really get rid of all these weapons until really the mid-2000s. So in fact, I'll tell you what the turning moment was in my life, and that was that my daughter in 2005 was applying for college. And she was quantitatively oriented like me. She wanted to be an engineer, and she gave serious thought to going to the Air Force Academy to study engineering. And because it's a good program. And she would have started in 2006. And my reaction to that when I gave it some thought is that, I didn't want my daughter to be put in the same position that I was. I did not want my daughter to be put in a position of having to turn keys to launch up to 50 missiles that would kill, really today, would kill tens of millions of people. And there are now women who are in who are missileers. There have been since the mid-'80s. And none of them, hardly any of them are there voluntarily. They get drafted, assigned to this job. No one really wants the job, missile launch control officer. And so there's a distinct possibility that my daughter would graduate from the Air Force Academy and be assigned as a missile launch control officer with this sort of heavy responsibility on her shoulders, and I thought it was wrong. I came to reflect more deeply on it and decided that society has put everyone, way too many people in the position of having to uphold this policy of deterrence. And so I decided I was really ready to see the elimination of nuclear weapons, particularly in an era of proliferation, with weapons being developed and deployed by more and more countries, India, Pakistan, North Korea, and et cetera, and possibly Iran. And to me, the writing is on the wall. Those countries have far worse safeguards. They're way behind us in safety and security. And if this continues, this proliferation continues, it's inevitable that nuclear weapons are going to be used. So that's where I was in 2006 when I met my co-founder, Matt Brown, who grew up in an activist family, and for some reason he believed fervently that in the elimination of all nuclear weapons. He came to me, he sought me out. He had just left office as Secretary of State of Rhode Island, found me in Washington, and we hit it off, and we decided that we would launch Global Zero. That was summer of 2006.
I don't think I ever actually knew that. Yeah, that's super. I could ask Bruce questions all day, every day, but I think it's definitely time to curb my curiosity and turn it over to you guys to just ask Global Zero co-founder anything you want. You've been working for this organization. You've been doing amazing work. And now is your opportunity to ask Bruce the things you've been wanting to know. And as a reminder for our those of you joining us online, you can either chat your questions on YouTube or you can tweet at Global Zero with the hashtag #EliminateNukes. So,
questions?
Hi, I'm really excited to be here, and I'm from Korea, and I live next to a very nuclear active part of the country, and I have a family there, and who constantly live in fear of being threatened by a nuclear weapon. And we have had talks about how to stop North Korea from continuing their program, but as personally, I have not seen much progress. And I think that is due to lack of transparency and communication with North Korea. And I was wondering what you think is the most problematic issue with stopping North Korea from doing continuing their program, and what we propose a solution to this kind of problem.
Yeah, well, it's a conundrum, and I put it sort of in the same category as Iran. It's a very, very tough nut to crack. But North Korea has this program. It has probably 10 or a dozen nuclear weapons, and under the control of an impulsive leader, Kim Jong-un. And we've tried to stand down that program since the 1990s and have not succeeded through 6 power talks involving the United States, Russia, China, South Korea, and Japan, as well as North Korea. And we were almost there a couple times, I think, where we almost cut a deal, the essence of which was, or will be that we no longer threaten regime change in North Korea. North Korea has to have confidence that in its security, long-term security. That's a big concession. We don't like the regime. It's an autocratic, horrible government, and we don't like to cut deals with countries like that. But that's almost certainly going to be the sine qua non for North Korea to agree to, first of all, even freeze its program, and secondly, then negotiate its complete elimination. We have to offer, and we have offered, a peace treaty with North Korea and a guarantee of its security in exchange for it standing down its arsenal. I think that's the formula. If we had Donald Trump, I'm sure he'd work out the deal overnight. But we have to, part of the problem is that, Global Zero is not a unilateral disarmament movement. demands that all countries disarm. The United States will cut, reduce, and disarm in parallel with every other country. And so if there is a movement that gains momentum, that engages the other countries in reductions, then it would, I think, contribute, facilitate successful negotiations with North Korea. But it's a very, very tough problem. By the way, on activism, let me just say that I don't know how long this is going to last, but I do want to say this, that you are all indispensable for the success of this project, Global Zero. You know, when Matt and I first formed Global Zero, we thought we could really make a lot of headway on the cheap. We thought we could produce a movie, which we did, Countdown to Zero. It was produced by the same producer that produced Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth. And we thought we could produce a movie that would really change the dialogue, would do for our issue what that movie did for climate change, and move millions of people to embrace the goal of the elimination of nuclear weapons. It didn't work. It's obviously like this campaign has got to have all of its pistons working at full speed, and many of them. And it's clear that without grassroots pressure on leaders, some of whom are predisposed to our cause, like President Obama, without you and without the pressure you can generate, we'll never succeed. You are essential to our success. Unfortunately, we have also campaigns in other countries, and we can't generate grassroots support in countries like China and North Korea and Russia because it's not really permitted. It's not done. And so we have other strategies tailored to other countries. We could talk about that some other time. That's a small digression, but I just wanted to make sure before you all fell asleep that I got that out. Thank you.
Thanks so much. It's really awesome to hear you speak on everything about Global Zero. In regards to Global Zero, what's your proudest achievement so far?
I think it has been, for the first couple of years before we launched it, I went around the world. I was on the road with Matt Brown more than I was with my family, and we went around the world talking to people who we thought would sort of basically reject our arguments and send us packing. And what we discovered was that there's just huge latent belief, conviction, faith in the Global Zero purpose. That some of the most senior people around the world would say to me, Bruce, this is my dream. This is what I want to see happen in this world. That was said by the most senior Chinese foreign policy official. That was said by Jaswant Singh of the BJP. He was a civil servant in India who was instrumental, really, in almost persuading the conservative BJP party of India to pursue a nuclear program and test it in the 90s, because Jaswant said that he believed in the value of nuclear weapons for deterrence. He turned 180 degrees, and he said, and he started coming to Global Zero summits, meetings, and he would go on the dais and said, I was wrong. I believe in Global Zero, and the liabilities of nuclear weapons far outweigh any prospective benefits, including deterrence. So what was gratifying to me was to, without any trouble at all, really, except a lot of travel, to galvanize, mobilize former secretaries of defense, former foreign ministers, former four-star generals. You're going to meet a couple of them at this conference. to join forces with Global Zero to pursue this goal, and to work with young people too, by the way. I mean, they have been really, really fantastic in dedicating their time all over the world to working with the Global Zero activists. So that's been really fabulous. The second great thing has been to be backed up by all of you. I mean, to see with the hard work of my staff, Meredith, Jeff, and Jess, and everyone else now, but their predecessors, to see them succeed in bringing together a movement of young people, such as you, that are going to make this happen in due course. Not every one of you will go on, to work this issue. It took me 30 years to go from A to B. It'll take some of you that long, probably, but some of you will be instrumental. You don't realize it, but you'll be the catalyst for change.
Thank you, Dr. Blair. You talked about your time as a launch control officer, and there was a segment on PBS maybe 4 or 5 months ago that showed, the daily routine of doing the practice launches, all of that. One of the things that struck me is that they are still using the same computer systems that were probably in place when you were there. They run on, the 5-inch floppy disk, and in an age where cyber warfare from China or North Korea or whoever decides to do it, even a non-aligned group of hackers, what kind of threat do you think that poses to an accidental launch or a deliberate launch from a hacker?
You may have seen on that segment a statement by General Cartwright, who's going to be here this weekend, that we don't know what the full nature of that cyber threat to our nuclear forces and early warning network is. We just don't know. These systems are very complex, and the entry points into this system are hard to find, but they do exist. Don't believe anyone who tells you that the nuclear command system is firewalled, that there are air gaps that can't be jumped. I promise you, we have found access points into the nuclear command and control system. And I won't go into it here with you, but they have been found. And we're living in an era of increasing sophistication of cyber warfare. And so we're up against the question, given that what we know and don't know, it doesn't make sense to continue to keep nuclear missiles ready to be fired as soon as they get a short stream of computer signals. And that's what's going on right now. In Russia and the United States, hundreds of warheads sit atop missiles that are armed, targeted, fueled in both countries, and that are going to fire as soon as they receive a short stream of computer signals. And as I said, a person could fire them, sending those signals in less than a minute, Minutemen. But the computer doesn't care where they come from or how quickly they're received. If they get them, they're going to fire right out of their silos and fly to their targets on the other side of the planet. We cannot even certify that our nuclear command systems are bug-free, that they haven't been planted with malware in the software or the hardware, because we don't have full chain of custody over the supply of the equipment that goes into those systems. We have equipment from China in our nuclear command and control system that we have to, in other countries, that we have to give a waiver to in order to operate them without knowing for sure that they're bug-free. We have waivers on our nuclear command and control system in order to operate these forces. Is it prudent and sensible to have these weapons that are going to fire as soon as they get, the equivalent of a couple of passwords with enter in them, very small bandwidth? Doesn't make any sense. It's one of the new threats that you add to the pile that tell you that you just never can get ahead of this game. The only surefire way to eliminate these dangers is to get rid of nuclear weapons altogether.
Hey there. I have a question from Arthur from California on YouTube, who wants to know, are nuclear launch orders from the president cryptographically authenticated? In other words, is there any possibility that a launch message could be forged by someone else?
First of all, the President of the United States doesn't actually carry the launch codes. What he carries is a code that identifies himself as the President. So that if he's on an emergency conference with, say, the War Room at the Pentagon, he can validate the fact that he is, in fact, the President on that end of the telephone giving orders to the War Room in the Pentagon to send launch orders down the chain of command to people like missile launch officers, submarine crews, and bomber crews. So what happens is that the Pentagon then formats a short message. It's the length of a tweet. It's literally 30 characters, but usually spelled out, like Alpha, Zulu, Charlie, 1, blah, blah. 30 characters long, and it's spelled out on with an average of 5 characters per character. That's about the length of a tweet. And that can either be encrypted and encoded, or it can also be transmitted in clear voice message. You can get on the telephone. You can get on the telephone and just read out the message to the crews. So there are different variants of the transmission of this order. But at the bottom, at the end of the process, all of the crews go to their safes in the submarines or the bombers or the underground launch centers, and they take out these codes that you crack open. They're sort of plastic biscuit things, and you compare the codes inside the plastic casing with the codes that you got in that tweet launch order. And if they match, you're good to go, and you're off and running. That's the way it works. By the way, when I was in, we could have formatted a launch order, taken the codes out of our safe, inserted them into the launch order. I'd have to have a co-conspirator at another launch center who could get the opposite half codes and tell them to me, and then I put the other half into the launch order. And then I could have disseminated this tweet launch order from my underground launch center. We're talking about lieutenants here, to the entire U.S. strategic force, and it would have triggered Armageddon, because the standing rule when I was there at the time was that if you receive a valid launch order, regardless of the source, even if it's a little birdie that flies into your launch capsule carrying with a little capsule around its neck that you open up and it's got the right codes in it, your orders are to carry out that launch, regardless of the source. So we actually had the capacity not only to turn keys to launch 50 missiles in our squadron, but we could have triggered the launch of nuclear forces by all the rest of the Minuteman forces by transmitting this order out. That problem has been fixed, by the way.
Other questions?
Hi, I'm Mari. I'm coming in from McGill College, and I know one big thing with a group and organizations such as this is getting the support of this new and upcoming generation. They're getting the support of college students. And one thing that I noticed, at least in my college, is there's a lot of complacency within college students. So as soon as you mention something about nuclear weaponry, they kind of just like turn off. Their brain just kind of shuts off, and they say, okay, yeah, whatever. Yeah, it's a problem, but we can't really do anything about it. That's kind of their mentality that I've seen, at least in McDaniel. So in your experiences, like, what would be one of the best ways to, at least in a small college like McDaniel, to really kind of just gather support for this cause? Because I know that as has been said many times tonight, the more people we have, the greater wave we can cause. So, like, what would be some of the best ways to gather such support in college campuses?
Boy, I wish I knew the answer to that. As you have figured out, I'm kind of a wonky kind of guy, an academic and an analyst with a background in mathematics. And so I teamed up with Matt Brown because he was a politician and he knows how to run campaigns. And I don't. And you all know a lot more about this than I do. And by the end of this weekend, you'll be pros compared to me. I'm just sort of in awe of the ability of young people to get out the vote for President Obama, or to get out the support for causes. And some causes are harder to get support for than others, and this one is one of them. It's very, very difficult, but we've got some really smart people here. The brain power, the commitment, the passion, that once it's sort of organized and put to work, I'm convinced will turn the tide. Because I just think there's so many arguments that people can relate to and understand that, such as some of the ones that I've talked about here this evening. I mean, can we imagine living in this world with these kinds of problems in 9 nuclear weapons countries and counting? No, we really can't. So people have to understand the dangers and the urgency to alleviate them and eliminate nuclear weapons. It's your job. You tell me how you do that. I want to know. But I'm convinced that it can be done. Will be done.
Last question.
Thanks again for being here. I think one of the things, or maybe the thing that is the biggest obstacle for me being a Global Zero activist is burnout. And just listening to you speak about you and Matt Brown going around the world, traveling, not getting to spend time with your family, this might seem like kind of a trivial question, but I wonder what your self-care practices are, or if you have any advice for young activists who are doing this on the ground and maybe are just very, very tired and burnt out.
All I can tell you is that it is, I guess, to some extent, a calling, and it's a source of immense satisfaction to work hard problems from the bottom up. And if it was easy, it wouldn't be much fun, and it wouldn't be very satisfying. And it is hard, and it requires commitment. Not everyone has it. If you have it well up inside of you, and you understand that nuclear weapons could be the sort of end of humankind or civilization, as I believe we're on the, we're close to that situation, then you just, I don't know, it comes from some internal motivation that keeps you going in the face of a lot of skepticism, criticism, attacks, lack of support. But boy, if we pulled this off, it would just be a great thing. And I think it's a lot easier actually than to solve things like climate change. I mean, we only essentially have to get 9 statesmen, heads of countries, to agree to stand down and eliminate their nuclear arsenals, and they're gone. It's not, climate change. You have to change economic structures, technology, the way people live, and you have to coordinate it across the globe, because every major country is contributing to the problem. Here, basically, with the swish of a pen, you could solve the problem very quickly if only leaders understood that this needed to be done. And that's going to require, at least in the democracies, which is, where we have the most leverage, it's going to require this kind of commitment. And people like Obama respond to it. I mean, we've had meetings at the White House, and the senior people there say, generate the pressure so that you're pushing on our open door. They want people to generate pressure. They're predisposed to take these steps, but they find a hard time taking them politically unless they can point to popular support for the steps that they're taking. President Kennedy said he would have ratified the Atmospheric Test Ban Treaty, which prohibited the testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere, a lot earlier if only he had realized how popular that move was. Because before then we were bombing ourselves out in Nevada, the test site. We had scores and scores of nuclear explosions going off above ground and spreading radioactive debris across the entire United States. So children were showing up by the tens of thousands with strontium-90 in their teeth from milk that was produced by cows that eat the grass in the eastern United States, from the fallout from testing of these weapons all the way out in Nevada. So, change is possible, dramatic change is possible, and when it starts to happen, it happens faster than people realize. And so it can be a huge struggle, and then suddenly you wake up one day and your underdog candidate has been elected, or your underdog movement has moved a mountain.
Hey, I just have one more question. This is from Twitter, sort of topical as to what you were just talking about. But why do you think the Obama administration ditched his vision of nuclear disarmament?
A couple of reasons. The Prague vision of nuclear disarmament is sort of dead in the water right now. One big one is President Putin of Russia, who has rebuffed overtures from President Putin to continue further rounds of nuclear arms reductions. Obama put a proposal on the table in 2013 called the Berlin Proposal for a one-third cut. It's still on the table. He would run with it if Putin would agree to it. And by the way, that proposal came from Global Zero. We did a policy study in 2012 that called for a one-third reduction down to about 1,000 weapons. And that study was then briefed to President Obama by one of our senior people, a four-star general in Global Zero, and President Obama decided to go for it, even though it wasn't really all that popular and well supported within his administration. Which leads me to a segue here, which is that I think President Obama appointed the wrong people to pursue his agenda. And so we got a great speech, and we got some momentum on another round of strategic arms reductions. But he didn't really give the message to his appointees and to his bureaucracy that he wanted this to happen, that he wanted a plan for a logical progression of steps leading to deep cuts in the elimination of nuclear weapons. And along the way, you have to bring all the other countries into this process, not just Putin and company. Because all the other countries have been getting a free pass. It's just the United States and Russia that have been for half a century negotiating strategic nuclear arms reductions. And everyone else has just gone off on their merry way. And so for Global Zero to succeed, we need an international movement that puts pressure on the leaders of all the other countries and brings them into the process. So I do fault President Obama for not really, giving the orders to his marching orders to his bureaucracy that this is really what he wants to have done. And let's see a plan. Let's bring it up to the White House, review the plan. And let's really go for it.
All right, I would like to extend my appreciation to Bruce for being here and for sitting down and talking with us, and for all of those people who joined us online, and for all of you in the room for being here. So please join me in thanking Bruce.